The wedding had been a grand affair, filled with laughter, clinking glasses, and promises of a bright future. Arun, the newlywed son-in-law, had been swept into a family so different from his own, loud, affectionate, and filled with stories of a shared past. At the head of this family was Prakash, the patriarch, a man whose presence commanded both respect and admiration. In his mid-50s, with streaks of silver in his hair and a baritone voice that seemed to carry wisdom, Prakash was the kind of man Arun had always admired but never encountered in his own quiet upbringing. The initial weeks of Arun's marriage to Meera were filled with warmth, though the adjustment wasn't without its challenges. Arun, reserved and introspective, often found himself overwhelmed by the sheer energy of the household. It was during these moments of retreat, when he would quietly slip onto the veranda to watch the sunset, that he began to notice Prakash joining him. Their first meaningful conversation happened one such evening. Arun had been staring at the fading orange sky, lost in thought, when Prakash handed him a steaming cup of tea. "You remind me of myself at your age," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a gentle wave. Surprised, Arun turned to him, unsure of what to say. Prakash smiled, a mix of amusement and understanding on his face. "Quiet. Observant. Always in your own head." From that moment, a tentative bond began to form between them. Prakash had a way of making Arun feel seen in a way few people ever had. He would share stories from his younger days, tales of ambition, heartbreak, and resilience. Arun listened intently, drawn to the raw honesty in Prakash's words. In return, Arun found himself opening up in ways that surprised him. He spoke of his insecurities, his fear of not living up to expectations, and his struggle to find his place in a family that seemed so close-knit. Prakash's response was always measured, his advice wrapped in anecdotes that lingered long after their conversations ended. Yet, beneath the growing camaraderie, there was a tension neither acknowledged. Arun couldn't pinpoint when admiration began to blur into something more complex. It wasn't just the wisdom or the charisma, it was the way Prakash seemed to understand him, to see through his silences and respond to emotions Arun hadn't yet named. By the time Meera began to notice how often her husband and father shared quiet moments together, the connection had already deepened. Arun told himself it was nothing, just a familial bond forged through shared experiences. But late at night, as he lay awake, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this dynamic wasn't ordinary. As the days turned into weeks, the unspoken nature of their connection became both a comfort and a burden. Arun found himself at a crossroads he didn't yet fully understand, his world on the brink of a change he wasn't prepared for. It started with small, seemingly innocent gestures. A shared smile over breakfast, a lingering glance across the dining table, or a brief moment of silence that spoke louder than words. Arun couldn't ignore the subtle shift in his dynamic with Prakash. What had begun as admiration was now laced with an unnameable tension, an unspoken connection that seemed to bloom in the quiet corners of their shared moments. Prakash, too, was not blind to this change. He noticed how Arun sought him out during family gatherings, gravitating toward his calm presence amid the chaos. He saw it in the younger man's eyes, a mixture of respect, curiosity, and something deeper, more complex. For Prakash, it was both unsettling and exhilarating. It had been years since anyone had looked at him that way, and though he wouldn't admit it, the attention stirred something long dormant within him. One evening, as rain pattered softly against the windows, Prakash found Arun in the study, flipping through an old family photo album. The room was dimly lit, the only sound the soft crackle of the fire. "You found our treasure trove," Prakash said, his voice carrying warmth. Arun looked up, startled but pleased by the interruption. "Your family has such a rich history," he replied, gesturing to the photos. Prakash sat beside him, their shoulders nearly touching. "Every photo has a story," he said, turning the pages slowly. As they lingered on a picture of a younger Prakash, standing tall beside his late wife, Arun couldn't resist asking, what was she like? For the first time, Prakash hesitated. His usual composure faltered as he spoke of his wife's laughter, her kindness, and the void she left behind. Arun listened intently, his heart aching for the man beside him. It was in this moment of vulnerability that their bond deepened. Over the following weeks, their conversations grew more intimate. Prakash began sharing pieces of himself that he had kept hidden even from his family, his fears, his regrets, his moments of doubt. Arun, in turn, opened up about his own struggles, confiding how he often felt like an outsider in his own life. Their connection was undeniable, but it was also fraught with an undercurrent of guilt. Arun often caught himself questioning his feelings, berating himself for the way his heart quickened in Prakash's presence. For his part, Prakash wrestled with a moral conflict he couldn't articulate. Yet, neither man could bring himself to sever the bond they had formed. One evening, as they sat together on the veranda, Prakash broke the silence. "You've brought something back into my life I thought I'd lost forever," he said softly. Arun didn't reply, but the weight of his unspoken emotions hung in the air between them. Both knew they were walking a precarious line, but neither could step away. The unspoken bond had become a sanctuary, a place of understanding that neither was ready to abandon, even as the cracks in their world began to show. The evening had started like any other, with the family gathered for dinner. Conversations overlapped, laughter echoed through the dining room, and clinking cutlery filled the silences. Yet, beneath the surface, Arun felt a growing tension. Prakash's eyes met his across the table, just briefly, but the unspoken understanding in that glance was undeniable. It was a connection that had grown too powerful to ignore, and tonight it felt dangerously exposed. After dinner, Arun excused himself, retreating to the study under the guise of work. He hoped for a moment to collect his thoughts, but the solitude only made his inner turmoil more pronounced. How had he allowed himself to reach this point? He was devoted to Mira, yet his emotions for her father had taken root in a place he couldn't reach to uproot. The door creaked open, breaking his reverie. Prakash stepped inside, his expression unreadable. "You left in a hurry," he said, closing the door behind him. Arun's heart raced, but he forced a neutral smile. "Just needed a quiet moment." Prakash approached, his presence filling the small room. "You've been avoiding me," he said, his tone gentle but direct. Arun looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm trying to do the right thing," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Prakash sighed, sinking into the chair across from him. "The right thing," he repeated, as though testing the phrase. "And what is that, Arun? Pretending this doesn't exist? Pretending we don't see each other in ways we shouldn't?" Arun felt the weight of those words, their truth cutting through his defenses. He wanted to deny it, to insist that everything was normal, but the emotions swirling within him refused to be dismissed. This isn't right," he finally said, his voice trembling. "It's not fair to Mira. To the family." Prakash leaned forward, his expression filled with a mixture of pain and longing. "I know," he said softly, "but that doesn't make it any less real." Before either could say more, the sound of footsteps in the hallway froze them both. The door opened abruptly, and there stood Mira, her face a mixture of confusion and suspicion. "What's going on?" she asked, her eyes darting between the two men. Arun stammered, searching for an explanation, but Mira's gaze lingered on her father. "Why do I feel like I'm interrupting something?" she asked, her voice sharp with unspoken accusation. Prakash rose, his usual composure faltering. "Mira, it's nothing. We were just talking." But Mira wasn't convinced. The tension in the room was palpable, and her instincts told her there was more to the story than either man was willing to admit. Without another word, she turned and left, her silence more damning than any accusation. Arun sank back into his chair, his chest tight with regret. The fragile balance they had maintained was beginning to crumble, and the fallout was inevitable. As Prakash placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, Arun realized their sanctuary had been breached, and there was no turning back. The confrontation Mira had been avoiding finally arrived one quiet morning. She sat across from Arun at the breakfast table, her eyes heavy with unspoken questions. The warmth that once filled their home now felt like a distant memory, replaced by a silence that suffocated them both. Arun's guilt weighed on him like a stone, and the words he longed to say felt lodged in his throat. "I need to know," Mira said, her voice steady yet trembling beneath the surface. "Is there something you're hiding from me?" Arun froze, unable to meet her gaze. The truth hovered between them, too complex and painful to articulate. "It's not what you think," he began, his voice hollow. But the ambiguity of his words only deepened her suspicion. Mira pressed her lips into a thin line. "Then tell me what it is," she demanded, her composure cracking. "Because whatever this is, it's tearing us apart." Before Arun could respond, Prakash entered the room. His presence, usually a source of calm, now felt like a spark in an already volatile atmosphere. Mira turned to him, her frustration spilling over. "You've been acting strange too," she accused. "Both of you. What aren't you telling me?" Prakash's face betrayed a flicker of guilt, but he quickly masked it with his usual stoicism. "Mira, this isn't the time," he said firmly, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Mira refused to be placated. "No, the time was weeks ago when I first noticed something was wrong," she retorted. "I deserve honesty. From both of you." The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of her demand pressing down on them. Prakash glanced at Arun, his expression torn. Finally he spoke, his voice heavy with regret. "Mira, your husband and we've crossed boundaries we shouldn't have." The admission hit Mira like a physical blow. She recoiled, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "How could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. Arun reached for her hand, but she pulled away, tears streaming down her face. "You were supposed to be my husband," she said, her voice filled with anguish. "And you, my father. How could you do this to me?" Prakash stepped forward, his composure crumbling. "Mira, I take full responsibility," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I failed you as a father. This was never meant to happen." But his words did little to soothe her pain. Mira stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "I need time," she said coldly, before leaving the room. In the days that followed, the household was a shadow of what it once was. Arun and Prakash kept their distance, each grappling with their guilt and the consequences of their actions. Slowly, Mira began to rebuild herself, setting boundaries and demanding accountability. In the end, the bond between Arun and Prakash dissolved, their connection now a painful memory. They chose to prioritize healing the family, though they knew the scars would remain. Some wounds, after all, never fully heal.